Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm John Zipper, the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial, and Michelle's co-host for this program. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Commonwealth Club is a 118-year-old nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to the civil discussion of important issues of the day. Any views expressed are those of the speakers. Now, the Commonwealth Club is producing hundreds of programs a year, even during the pandemic. So head over to commonwealthclub.org/MMS for all upcoming programs, plus podcasts and video of past events. Today's program is part of our Good Lit series, underwritten by the Bernard Osher Foundation. Now, if you're watching us live on YouTube, use the chat box to submit questions for our special guests today. So you're in for a good conversation, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Michelle Meow, the producer and host of the Michelle Meow Show and a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors. Good to see you again, Michelle.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to all of you for joining us today for an exciting discussion. We have some great speakers. We'll discuss who is really behind America's appetite for foods from around the world, and we will also explore in depth how food journalism, food media, and the food establishment impacted many voices, particularly immigrant women who have shaped and revolutionized the way we eat today. Our guests today include Reem Assil, who's the chef and owner of Reem's California and Reem's California Mission. We also have Alicia Kennedy, who's writer and author from the desk of Alicia Kennedy newsletter, and Mayuk Sen, who's the author of the book that we'll be discussing today. It's our central focal point of Tastemakers, 7 Immigrant Women Who Revolutionized Food in America. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
I'm so excited for this conversation. I mean, I love food. I love talking about food, and I love, just being very serious and political about the food that we eat. Why don't we start with Mayuk and the book? Like, what inspired you to write the book, to write it in this way, and also, the people that you chose to profile in this book?
Totally. Yeah. So I'm going to try my best to keep this, not be too garrulous here in my answer to you. But the idea for this book really came to me back in 2017 when I was a 25-year-old staff writer at a site called Food 52. And back then, I was writing a lot of stories on figures in the food world who belonged to marginalized communities. Oftentimes, they were women of color, people of color more generally, queer people, immigrants of color, sometimes folks who belong to more than one of those groups. And what I was trying to do was recirculate their legacies and honor them in a way that I felt as though American cultural memory may have not, because there's certain figures who immediately leap to mind for the casual reader, let's say, like Julia Child, for example, who are instrumental to the way that Americans cook and eat today. Yet there's so many other names whom that casual reader does not know. And so a friend of mine looked at my budding body of work at Food 52 and was like, I wonder if there's a larger project in here about immigration and food, and maybe there's a way to, bring all these stories together. And I was like, I'm 25 years old. I am too young to write a book, so I put it in my back pocket and I was like, one day. Fast forward 1 year later, when I'm the ripe old age of 26, I'm like, actually, maybe I can write a book now, And I had noticed over the course of that year, the proliferation of certain talking points within the American food media that were along the lines of immigrants get the job done and immigrants feed America. And, I'll be charitable here and say that that might have been well-intentioned coming from these usually white-led publications, yet I found the proliferation of these talking points so unsettling because to me, they, continue to privilege a certain kind of consumer whom the American food media has privileged for so long. And that is someone who's white, middle to upper middle class. And it's basically saying that, immigrants, to have any value or worth at all, they must, their value must be measured based on their productivity. And I found that so disturbing, especially as someone who was born to immigrants in this country. And so I felt as though the best way for me to combat it within my very limited skill set as a storyteller was to tell the stories of individual immigrants who had labored and really changed the way that America eats in the most granular way possible. And that would be one small step in making sure the creative aspirations, let's say, of immigrants was not abstracted in the way that I'd seen it so often in the American food media. So that's where this book began. And I sold it at the end of 2018. And the 7 women I had in my proposal stage are not the 7 women who ended up being in this book, because I realized when I began writing that I needed to, I had chosen so many subjects who were no longer with us. And as a result, I needed to seek out women who had left behind materials that presented them speaking in their own voices. So those were usually memoirs, cookbooks with memoiristic passages, or a wealth of interviews they'd given to the press that really allowed me to see how they wanted the world around them and the public to perceive them. And that was a challenge, because I realized that the women who could afford to have their stories recorded at all in that way through memoir, for example, possess certain material privileges. So that was a struggle, but I made it happen.
You also, kind of front and center, right from the beginning of the book, right from the introduction, you're addressing the fact that you're getting into the large systemic and conceptual issues that you've already touched on here. Was that a hard sell when you were taking this to the publisher, or were publishers kind of like, yeah, there's forgive the term, there's an appetite for this now, and not just talking about food or something like that?
Yeah, I got some. I was very fortunate to get this book going into auction, which is nice. Yet I got a lot of reluctance from food publishers in general, ones who were typically just putting out cookbooks and very little narrative food nonfiction. I think the absence of recipes, for example, in my book was something that really deterred a lot of publishers from taking my book on, because they felt as though the presence of any recipes at all would be a way to ensure this book's commercial viability. And what I wanted to really prove in this book is that food writing does not necessarily need that service aspect to mean anything to the general reader, but it was tough, certainly. And I think I got more interest from non-food publishers in this book than I did from food publishers. But I don't know, that was 3 years ago. And the events of the past few years have certainly changed the landscape in some ways. I won't, I'm a little cynical about how much it's changed for the better or, long term. But perhaps it'd be easier to sell this book now.
Let's have a group discussion about the way that we talk about food, but particularly how, yes, women, immigrant chefs, we've had to change not just the recipe, but even the description of the food that we cook to appease somebody. Who is it? Who makes these decisions? But we'd like to hear from the entire panel in the problems of having to change the way we describe our food. And for example, I have so much respect for Reem, because calling Arab food shouldn't be a problem, but why is it a problem? Let's have an open discussion about the history of having to change the way that we talk about the food that we cook. Who'd like to open up with some thoughts? Alicia?
Sure. Well, I, as not a restaurant chef, nor, someone who is naming food necessarily, it's not a concern I personally have to deal with. But in my understanding and experience of food media, there's a lot of pressure to cater to a middle white American gaze that's understood as neutral in US food media. And so there's always this push and pull to make sure everything is accessible. But when the word accessible is used, I don't think that people really are engaging with the idea of whose access is being privileged. And this is one of those things that as Mayukh mentioned, is maybe changing, but we haven't seen at the end, we haven't really seen that change in a real way. And I think Reem can speak to the concrete ways in which that affects her own business.
Yeah, this is obviously the crux of the question of what happens when it's the intersection of food, but also livelihood, right? And the fact that we are sort of living in the land, the belly of the beast, in the land of consumption, and food and culture definitely sort of fall under that bucket, unfortunately. And so when I sort of approached, Reem's for me as a lifelong project. It was never meant to just be a restaurant, but sort of as I grew, it became sort of a source of livelihood, not just for myself, but a whole gamut of people around me, a whole ecosystem of workers, right? And so it was important to kind of figure out sort of, here's Reem and here's my identity and what I'm trying to solve in terms of consciousness raising around my culture and in the context of the US, but then also here's what is needed to have a successful business. And those things didn't always, didn't always sort of align. However, I think that, as Mayu kind of said, even in the last, 5 to 6 years, the landscape has changed in terms of consumers and what people want and what people want to be a part of. And I think that me being unapologetic, leading with my Arab identity, leading with my politics, actually turned out to be successful for my business. And that does speak to sort of where people are at across the spectrum, right, of access, so to speak. In the beginning, I was like, yeah, I really want to. I wanted the Trojan horse effect of, I remember telling my mom, we're going to say Arab, we're going to mainstream. I was like, we're going to mainstream that shit, for lack of a better word. Like, to be Arab is to be cool. But I think that, the media, food media is not, it's a microcosm of the broader media here in the US, are going to try to take that and sterilize it a little bit. And I didn't want that to happen. And I do feel like that started to happen for me as I sort of started to get, media started to sort of follow Reem's and my path. And it is this sort of uncomfortable friction of, I want to be on the fringes, but I want to be accessible. I don't want to lose the meaning of, what my food represents. So how do I sort of play that balance? And we're still trying to figure that out. We're still trying to sort of push the envelope. I think the one thing that's changed with the pandemic is that we're much less Trojan horse-like. We want to make everything accessible and much more just explicit about our politics. And so far that we've tread the waters. Hopefully that will continue. And, I'm not alone. I feel like that's part of that, is being sort of part of this community of trailblazers like this book. I mean, this book really got me upset and happy and all the things at the same time, because I could see myself in all these women who came before me. And I think that I've been afforded privileges that they didn't have because of the landscape and how it's changed. So I'll stop there.
Oh, Reem, you go ahead, Mike.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I'm reminded of the story of one of the women in my book, just in hearing both these responses. And that's the story of Najmeh Batmanglij, who was a refugee from Iran who fled to France initially around the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And then in the early 80s, came to America because she realized that France was not necessarily the most hospitable place to raise her 2 young sons. And upon coming to America, she had already published an Iranian cookbook back in France. She was credentialed in all the right ways to basically, she wanted to, when she came to America, publish her own English language Iranian cookbook. Yet upon sending out query letters to different publishers, she got a lot of polite rejections if she got any responses at all. And this was, again, just years after the Iranian Revolution. And in addition to that, the Iran hostage crisis cast a very long shadow. And so initially what she did was she and her husband, Mohammed, decided to self-publish their own cookbooks by Najmieh. They just started their own publishing house. They, raised enough capital to do so. And that was very challenging for them, of course, yet they kind of, they reached an impasse when it came to titling the book, because they were not sure whether to refer to the book as one on Iranian food or Persian food, because, Iranian within the white American gaze, let's say, had become a sort of dirty word, in the early 80s in the landscape in which she was working. And Persian, may have been a bit of a safer choice. It may have ensured that her book would have a wider audience, certainly an audience beyond the Iranian diaspora. And eventually what happened is the subtitle that she chose, included both the word Persian and Iranian. And so she basically owned, very proudly her Iranian identity and her Iranian heritage. And eventually, as the decades went on, her audience would widen beyond the Iranian diaspora. Yet I do wonder, had she chosen the understandable and easy path of just labeling her food and cookbook Persian back in the 80s, maybe her audience would have looked different immediately and would have gone beyond the Iranian diaspora immediately. Who knows?
Well, that kind of touches on something that, and Reen had mentioned something in this area too. So I kind of want to get all of your responses on this, and that is we've kind of touched on the changing audience, and you kind of let's just kind of say writ large the changing American consumer or eater or whatever. Is that changing because more of it is being educated to appreciate other foods, or is it changing because literally the complexion of the American population is changing, and there are more immigrants into it? And what do you think is behind the change, and what do you think is changing?
Who wants to take this one? I'm still chewing on it. I'll start. I will just say that for a lot of the women in this book, especially the ones who are working right around the time of World War II, and the decades following that, like around the time of 1965's Hart-Celler Act, which was in many ways a real landmark, immigration law. A lot of these women did find themselves working for a very specific gaze and writing for a very specific audience, and that is that very white, middle top or middle class consumer whom I was referencing earlier. Yet as time went on, I think a lot of the women in this book especially realized that, just confining your work to that audience that some may call mainstream, for example, or the dominant culture, let's say, was not the only path towards financial stability, for lack of better term. And, one of the women who really realized that was Najmieh Batmanghelidj, whom I just mentioned. She was very much writing for the Iranian diaspora, and that is where she found her most devoted audience at first. And then eventually the audience widened. And the same goes for the subject of my final chapter, Norma Shirley, who was a Jamaican-born Black female chef who tried to open her own restaurant that expressed her culinary vision without filter in the early 1980s, New York. And that very vision was making Jamaican food with French food with Jamaican flair, is how she put it at one point. Yet it was impossible for her to secure enough access to capital to make that dream a reality. And so what she did instead was she returned to Jamaica, and she realized her vision by cooking for her own people. And that was her path to success. And so I think that, as time has gone on and, with the advent of, let's say, social media and what it's done to widen certain audiences beyond that kind of a white middle top or middle class consumer, you see maybe fewer folks who are culinary creatives who are solely creating for that kind of consumer. But I do think also, this country the complexion is changing, as you said earlier, and I think that a lot of food journalists like myself may no longer be presuming that majority white audience that, you may have maybe 5-6 years ago. So.
Also, you're talking especially about the people coming in post World War II and for decades after that. That was like the heart of the time of industrialization, of corporatization, of whatever we can package into this tinfoil thing and freeze and ship across the country, and it's going to taste the same for everybody, and it's not going to upset anyone, so it's not going to have much taste at all. And that so wonderfully has been going away over the past few decades. I think, it was so much more introduction of not just from the organics, but just, the shopping local and the eating local, and obviously the elevating of a lot of different chefs. So I'm kind of thinking there may be a couple strands here that are coming together at the same time. Alicia, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Well, actually, yeah, I was going to say something about what you just said, which is that I think that people are in the media a little bit more open to new voices, especially open to new foods. I think we've seen a lot of the idea that people accept a cuisine before they accept people, and they accept changes in what they eat before they accept changes politically that relate to these things. And so I do think that food media is shifting in some ways, but it's not shifting when we talk about mainstream food media as much around the discussion of power structures, the continued effects of industrialization of agriculture. I know you're in California, so you're lucky, but for a lot of us, we are not so lucky. And so, talking about, the government subsidies that really affect what most people are eating, what's genetically modified ingredients are in, I think, 75% of processed foods. There are these conversations happening, but they are still not, they're still, on the sidelines of the mainstream conversation. And so I think that it definitely shows that we open up the gates a little bit, but very, very slowly, very minimally.
Yeah. I would just add to that I mean, these things don't come in a vacuum. So there's a lot of sort of organizing that's happening, in the US context to get us to where we are today. So I'm certainly sort of aware of my privilege in that wasn't afforded to, the Arabs who came before me, who did package their food in under the guise of Greek or Middle Eastern or whatever, Mediterranean or whatever, like that. All of those things matter. Oh, did I freeze? Can you guys hear me?
You're fine. You haven't frozen.
You froze. Okay. As long as I didn't freeze. I think that, I think the thing that I struggle with is this, what I hope is that I feel like a lot of the women in your book, Mayuk, they wanted to express themselves. Yes, there was we need to make a livelihood, but people are not, I don't want to sell my culture as a product, if that makes any sense. I think that people are they're not just looking for a new thing or a discovery. I mean, certainly there is that group of people who are going to buy cookbooks because they want to learn about a new cuisine. But for me, the way that I've approached this is just to be authentically me. And I think that people are looking for things that are more fluid and outside the box, where they can see a little bit of themselves in that thing. So as opposed to the fundamentals in Arab cooking, I'm the cookbook I'm coming out with is here's me, I'm an Arab woman, and you can see yourself in that too, So I do think that people are looking for reflections of themselves in whatever that cuisine is. And I'm hoping that is where we're moving towards, a sort of more fluid society where people have intersection of identity. And they're yeah, I can relate to that, or this is interesting. It's not I just want to take on a new cuisine because it's this packaged thing that I don't know about. So that's how my restaurants function. I've always approached it. It's not to make it accessible so that I don't scare them away, but it's to make them see something in themselves when they walk into my restaurant. That Arab hospitality is for everyone, that kind of thing. Not to sound cliche, but yeah, so I'm hoping that we're sort of moving in that direction, and that's what is driving people's consumption to some extent.
I was going to jump off that if that's okay, not to yap on or whatever, so excuse me. But, I'm just reminded of the story of another one of the women in my book, just listening to what Reem had to say. And that is Elena Zalieta, who's actually based in the Bay Area for most of her professional life. She was originally born in Mexico, yet came here to America around the time of the Mexican Revolution. And, at first, so she was a cookbook author, and in addition to being a television cooking host and, owning restaurants and so on. And a lot of her early cookbooks, starting in the 1940s, they were solely focused on the Mexican and Spanish origin recipes of her youth. Yet over time, she started to see California as her real home. And her cookbooks began to reflect that sense of place and that shifting sense of place. And her final few books, are more focused on what she called California cuisine. And they would borrow techniques and ingredients from Japanese and Italian culinary traditions, and other traditions that immigrant populations within California, really celebrated. And my hypothesis in my book is that that may be one reason why Elena Zalieta is not a household name these days, in spite of the fact that, she accomplished so much and she was a star of her time. There may have been an expectation, back in the 1940s and just, throughout the 20th century for someone like Elena Zalieta to be the ambassador of the cuisine of her country of origin, right? Even if her creative aspirations were more nuanced and a bit different, and they reflected the fact that she called America home and she had certain experiences in America that shaped her palate and the way that she thought about food. Yet those voices, at least in the past, may not be as easily remembered as someone who is tasked with having that sort of ambassadorial role for the cuisine of their country of origin. And so I hope that's changing, like Reem said,
One of the thoughts that popped up in my mind while reading the book, and then also merging all three of your experiences, I was thinking about authenticity. Reem had brought that up, right? But why authenticity is considered at times controversial when it comes to, food, or non-American food, you should say, or chefs who are cooking ethnic food. But my question to the three of you is, who gets to become an author? Who gets to be a food journalist, that they take seriously? Like, who makes these decisions? Because as a consumer, I'm always chasing, the authentic voices, the genuine voices. I want to know the history of the chef who's cooking the food that I want to try or I want to eat. I really don't want it watered down, and I would not want their voices changed. But apparently there's somebody or someone or something, an establishment, that gets to market what we eat. I'd love for all of you to add your thoughts on it, and especially, Alicia, in food media, food journalism, and not, and creating space for some of our most authentic and genuine chefs or food people.
Well, yeah, for me, I had to kind of leave established outlets in order to start a newsletter to talk about the issues that I wanted to talk about and talk to the people that I wanted to talk to about those issues, and in a really candid way. I've interviewed obviously both Reem and Mayuk, and I think that we had conversations that would literally never be published in a food magazine in both cases. And so that's what I've always tried to cultivate in my work, is a space for people's actual perspectives and actual totalities, and like those intersectional identities that Reem was talking about, where you don't have to be put on the performance of who that's packaged of who you're supposed to be. You just need to be you. And I think that that's something that's just not cultivated in mainstream media. And that's because that's by design. A magazine is selling itself as a brand. When I worked at Time Inc. isn't Time Inc. anymore. But when I was at Time Inc., they were like the brand. They call each magazine a brand. They don't call it a magazine. You know, it's not like a publication. They call it a brand. And so it's selling that perspective. It's selling that lifestyle to you. And so now we're finally seeing spaces open up in food journalism where maybe we're all still selling a brand, but at least it's a different brand. You know, there's Vittles out of London. That's another newsletter that, you know, publishes writing specifically from the UK, but from all over the world and from perspectives from all over the world, really global in its scope. There's Whetstone from Stephen Satterfield that, you know, they have a whole South Asian vertical to cover different issues from that part of the world. And so I think that the plurality of voices that's coming out now and the plurality of perspectives is really going to, I hope, break things open for people who are looking for that more genuine kind of perspective and engagement with food culture, because I still think that, you know, when we're talking about the big outlets, they're really constrained by advertising still. They're really constrained by, you know, when you have a huge audience, that means you also have you have to kind of find the middle of that audience and not make them too angry on either side. And so it can be really difficult to do new things in that space. And so I think that, we're independent media in food is really breaking things open now, I hope, and giving new space for people who haven't felt connected to the more mainstream outlets.
Yeah, you know, I mean, so much of what you just said mirrors my own experience as someone practicing in the field or whatever for 5 years now, because like I said at the top of this conversation, I got my start at a site called Food 52. And, you know, when I first began writing for them, and I was quite open about this, I got really ruthless comments from readers who were just like, why'd you hire this, you know, this child, you know, like we want our site back. We want our recipes back, you know, because they come to a food website for a very specific purpose. And that is to get their mind off of the chaos of the world. And sometimes those readers might be on the right side of the political spectrum, let's say. And it's tough because, you know, this industry, media and food media specifically, are both quite exclusionary in many ways, you know, racially, you know, class-wise, et cetera. And, you know, I do carry certain privileges in that, you know, I went to the right school that allowed me easy entry and access into an industry like this. And I present to this world as a man, and that affords me certain privileges in spite of the fact that I'm brown. Yet when I first got here, I found myself so confused because my own viewpoints did not necessarily have a home in the publications that I was writing for. And then as a result, I had to borrow a word that Reem used earlier, I had to sterilize my own voice, essentially, you know, and really, you know, write for as wide an audience as possible. Those folks who might get really angry at the fact that, you know, I am writing for a site like Food 52, while people who belong to my own community and whose politics align with my own. And that's really tough, you know, especially if you do belong to a marginalized community. And I really, really struggled with that at first. And I'm sure that someone can look at the broad contours of my CV and say, he's someone who, you know, he walked a very traditional path in this industry because he got some sort of institutional recognition early on. And he got, you know, he basically made those white institutions quite happy. Yet I was doing that because I needed to survive, you know, and getting that opened up access to capital and opportunity that otherwise would not have been afforded to me as a result of just who I am in this world. And so I do hope, you know, I was thinking a lot about this trajectory as I was writing this book. And I really hope that food journalists who belong to younger generations than I do will not have to have these same sorts of struggles or, you know, work to appease certain awards bodies or get in the right anthologies just for them to make enough, you know, money to survive in this industry and for their voices to be heard, you know, without filter and without the constraints that a more traditional publication might impose upon them. And I do think over the past year, as Alicia said, there has been an increased awareness of, independent food media like Vittles, like Whetstone, which is, I think is, or at least I hope, convincing younger or emerging food writers that, you don't necessarily have to write for a big paper to have made it.
Yeah, I think, it's just like such a funny thing for me. I don't take any, I feel like I worked really hard, but I got lucky to be in a time where all these emerging food writers were kind of covering my story. And, I don't take any of that for granted. It's funny when people are like, oh, Reem, you're like a media darling. If you look at my website, I've been covered by so many people. And yet, my restaurant still struggles, I'm still struggling emotionally. None of it actually ended up in material benefits for me, which was sort of the realization that I had, that that media didn't get me access to the real things I needed to survive. And I think that is the big, people want to cover these stories because they're interesting, but tomorrow they'll be yesterday's news. You have to kind of stay. And I didn't love, I think you start to become a token of if you sort of only rely on that organic media. And I think for me, that was something that I struggled with as sort of I became that I had more national attention. And I remember when people were like, you need to write a cookbook, that's your next thing. And I was like, for 2 years, didn't do it because I wanted to do it on my own terms. And I sort of found that the story that was being painted that really kind of compelled me to write a cookbook was that I became that sort of brown girl that brown girl makes it in the food industry with the unconventional path. Anyone can make it. As a result, I'm legitimizing the very system that that I want to change. And so that is sort of what finally compelled me of I'm starting to lose my own narrative, even when I have my own narrative, because I'm legitimizing this other meta narrative. But it was hard. I tried to sell a more autobiographical book and I wasn't important enough. People just wanted the recipes. And so that was a real struggle. And luckily, the book is a hybrid of the two. And hopefully people will receive it. But sort of even with someone who's considered a media darling, it's I'm still not important enough because it doesn't really sell the thing that they want to sell. And so I think until we sort of create our own medium outlets like this, like independent media by us, for us, that is going to continue to be a struggle that I have to navigate as a public figure. So I do gravitate towards the people who share my values when I choose now where I want to be featured or where I want to kind of give energy. And that's hard. That's hard when a lot of people are coming your way and want to cover your story that seems seemingly harmless, but you have to kind of figure out what are the sort of byproducts of doing that. So, yeah. But definitely the not turning to material benefits is a big thing that we have to talk about, especially for women, especially for gender nonconforming folks, especially for women of color. That has been the biggest sort of contradiction that I've seen with my male counterparts. So.
You've talked about how you are presenting your food and your culture in your restaurants. Tell us about your customers. Are they coming and you see them? Are they folks for whom this is their food, or are they testing it as something new? Who are you attracting to your food?
It's so interesting you say this. We have this situation where we know who our customer is, and I would say a good chunk of it is still sort of that 35 to 45 range, or that mid 30s range, white woman who, because we live in the Bay Area, who can afford, has enough disposable income to afford our food. That said, we have a variety of segments of our market. We have our community, we have our regulars, people in our neighborhood that keep Reams thriving. But you can tell when we've been in certain publications how our customer base changes and the values that they bring in and what they value. And it's, when we hit like a top 10 list in food and wine, our customer is not as nice, not as understanding, is there for a transactional relationship. And to me, that is like very telling of, what kind of food media we want and what is going to sustain us. So I just find that very interesting for us. What we're trying to do is build deep with the communities in our, in the places that we're in the neighborhoods that we're in. But to thrive as a restaurant, you need to have that consumer with the disposable income that is going to, even if they don't like it, because those tend to be the most stingiest ones, spend enough money so that we can pay our workers livable wages. So
that's so interesting. You say that, because I literally had one of the questions written down was, is that different to be serving food to, say, a first-time customer, preparing and serving food to that person, than it is to someone who comes to your restaurant every week and you know them by name and they're like, oh, yes. I want, you are getting different.
Absolutely. But I do think that the common thing that is most of the people that come into Reams has heard of Reams before. They don't just stumble upon Reams. So naturally, they're going to be a values-driven customer if they've read anything about Reams, which is awesome. Like that's what we want. We want people to shop with their values, and we're inviting them in. This is not just your space. This is our space. This is the space in the neighborhood that you're in. Like, we force people to engage with everything in that space. And that, obviously the pandemic has prevented us from doing that in the physical sense, but that is sort of how we present in the media, who we choose, what events we choose to be a part of, how, what talks that I choose to engage with, and so on and so forth.
I wanted to ask a question. I mean, I have so many questions. I'm going to go back to my notes very quickly here. I can't help but bring up the pandemic, and we, in the book, we talk a whole lot through American history, political history of the shared struggles that the women had faced, and we continue to face that even today. I can't imagine what the pandemic did to set us all the way back, but this is kind of a challenging question. But what would we need to do to support women in the food industry? What are some of the specific changes, like if you can even actually pinpoint it, that would alleviate some of these struggles that oftentimes the mainstream media does not want to talk about?
I don't know if anyone's stepping in. Well, I mean, I was going to say, so many of the things that I think would make everyone's lives better, would make women's lives better in the restaurant industry, are the things that we're not providing to all of our, we don't have nationalized healthcare. We don't have a livable minimum wage. We don't have proper paid parental leave. There are so many things that we don't provide to people that would make everyone's lives better, would make everyone's lives better in the restaurant industry for sure, would make everyone's lives more livable in terms of their access to good food in general as well. And so I think that it's definitely important to think about the fact that, the restaurant industry and the food industry isn't always siloed from the rest of society in the way that we sometimes talk about it or think about it. The livelihood and the well-being of a restaurant worker has a lot to do with the livelihood and well-being of me as a creative worker, or someone else as any worker. I think that's the way I think of it, at least these days.
Yeah, I'm Alicia, sorry, Reem, you go ahead.
Go ahead, Mayuk.
No, I was just going to say I'm with Alicia, universal healthcare, for example, and all those other barriers that Alicia just mentioned, I think would do a great deal to at least chip away at some of those barriers that are keeping certain voices from reaching wider audiences in the food world, certainly. And then, I kind of write this in the book, but in my afterword, I say that although these are systems-wide issues that require systems-wide solutions, and therefore the onus should not be on the consumer necessarily, I don't want the consumer to walk away from my book feeling completely powerless. And I think one thing that, our audience members can do today, if they feel, as passionately as the panelists do about these very topics and issues, is to make sure that you are routing whatever little money you do possess, or unless you do have a lot of disposable income, like some of Reem's customers do, to make sure that you're routing that money towards, independent food media, or, food publications, or creators like Alicia, for example, creative workers like Alicia, whose politics are truly progressive and advocating for that better and more just world. And maybe, reconsider whether you are materially supporting the existence of a publication that has time and time and again shown that it does not necessarily care about getting the stories or rendering the stories of people from marginalized communities with care and sensitivity. And we could talk all day about how many food publications exist in that vein.
Yeah, definitely material resources is a big piece of it. Like, pay us for our time when you ask us to provide material. I mean, I think that is a big thing. That was a big thing that the pandemic really, I'm like, okay, somebody's going to interview me. I'm going to think about, why don't you just pay me to write this article? Or, I think make spaces for more voices is a big one. When you're talking about workers, interview people who are on the front lines. Don't just interview sort of token spokespeople for a whole community of people. I think that is, very easy thing that media can do. But as consumers, for sure, I think it's like asking more questions, and definitely like the sector intersections are a really big one. Like for us at Reams, we are really trying to empower our workers, not just to take ownership of Reams, but to hopefully the skills that they're building to fight for things like affordable housing, to fight for things like universal healthcare, because accessible transportation, all of those things. So there's the civic engagement part, but we need to be writing about food in a broader context. We shouldn't be just siloing it to food media. Like, people should understand why it's important, why supporting restaurants is actually important for more societal change, right? So I think it goes both ways, being able to broaden the scope. Not to say that food doesn't need its own niche, but food is a universal issue. And I think the more we can, connect it to issues, like Alicia does that really, really well, like takes sort of a very, very non-food item and connect it back to food. Like, I think that we need to be doing more of that. So I certainly try to use my restaurant as a tool to talk about these larger issues that have nothing really to do with food, but using it sort of as a gateway.
Along the lines of specifically the pandemic, Mayuk, you've talked about and written about in the book, obviously the connections to capital and needing these connections and just to get something going or sustaining. During the pandemic, lots of businesses, but especially restaurants, as we all know, really hard hit. And I'm wondering if, because even with hundreds of billions of dollars that the government's shoveling out the door, it still takes businesses a lot of time having to navigate, getting their congressperson to contact and follow up on things, and having their bank check on the status of things. And I'm wondering if immigrant women and their communities as business entrepreneurs, are they at a disadvantage of not having as deep networks and or access to the people who can then make the calls, to put the pressure on, just to get something to keep their business going?
Yeah, it is certainly, per my reporting and research, both for this book and stories that I wrote during the pandemic, I did see a lot of those very barriers, and access to capital was so much tougher for people who belong to immigrant communities just generally, and especially immigrant women, because maybe they, did not necessarily have for example, dedicated PR folks who could really advocate for them and increase their visibility in a way that might lessen any roadblocks to capital, especially during such a challenging time as the pandemic. And what was really frustrating, I think, just as someone who existed within the American food media in spring of 2020, it was seeing so much sympathy within our industry for celebrity chefs who had to close their restaurants down, or maybe had to lay their workers off, which I saw, at least at first, and I'm going to be as diplomatic as I can in my criticism of some of my peers and colleagues. I saw a lot of sympathy directed towards celebrity chefs who were materially far more well off than their workers who were laid off would be, And so I do hope that changes moving forward. And that I do hope that it's not just those celebrity chefs who are familiar names to anyone who's a food enthusiast who are going to be able to, have a restaurant, after a catastrophe like the pandemic of this, these past 2 years.
I think that's so important to discuss in terms of what Reem was saying earlier about, not seeing the cultural capital she's been granted by media translate into actual material changes in her livelihood. And I think that that's also something that really needs to be discussed in the food world, which is that, we think that the job is done when you write a little story and you feel nice, or you read a little story and you feel nice, and maybe you go and you spend $30 or something, but like that's not where these stories end. And we have to actually have that sort of meta critique of what the cultural capital we're granting to people actually means, and that continued engagement with what that actually means. Because as Reem was saying, this isn't just about one chef at each restaurant, even though we continue to put that narrative out there, even under these terrible conditions for workers. But, it's about a network and an ecosystem when you're supporting a restaurant. And so, how are we engaging with that on a real level? That's not just about telling nice stories about women chefs or immigrant chefs, but getting them the access that these men have to get really nice stories written about them when they're in a Connecticut mansion and they laid off all their workers. Like why does cultural capital for a man translate into a mansion in Connecticut, and cultural capital for a woman chef translate into hustling her ass off still in 2021?
True that.
Yeah. I was like, whoa, it's hot. Reem, you want to add some thoughts to this?
I think Alicia dropped the mic on that one.
Yeah, exactly. Gosh. As we, wind down on our conversation, which has been so incredible. Thank you all so much for your time, and for Tastemakers, the book. I encourage you, if you're spending time with us this afternoon, you don't have a copy, get a copy of Tastemakers. But I would love to get your thoughts on the future, kind of sort of, because Reem, I think that you inspire so many of women and immigrant chefs or people in the food industry to be more authentic with their voice, which could then ignite an entire movement on its own if it hasn't done so already. But also with Mayukh, with this book, and challenging us to really not erase the people who have contributed so much to the way that we eat here in the country, but to think deeply also of how politics impact us. The food establishment may not change, or we might not have much confidence in them, changing the way they do things because of their reliance on capitalism. But what are your thoughts on what the future could look like if we just do what you all are doing, creating the space for our community to grow?
I could start. I think, yeah, I never wanted to do this work forever. I'm really inspired by a younger generation of folks that are way more creative than me in my organizing days. I'm a movement builder, and yeah, I'm really excited for the fertile ground that we're building for more localized, resilient uh, ecosystems. The people who come out of this more creative, you're seeing it now, towards a regenerative economy in which, you know, you just have small communities of people really building up their resiliency, and that, you know, a multitude of voices are out there, and so that we can be more creative, we can be more, for lack of a better word, resilient when we face hardships, because this pandemic is just the beginning. This is unfortunately, you know, we are going to struggle with the impacts of disaster capitalism, climate change, all these things. So I'm really, really excited about sort of the fertile ground that, at least, you know, on my little local corner of the world, trying to build in my workers, maybe inspire other business owners to build in their workers, and so on and so forth. So it's not just a few voices. I was really excited when, after Reams, you know, had been in the landscape, in the media for a good year or two, that other Palestinian cuisine, Arab cuisine started to pop up in other parts of the country. I'm not going to claim that, but I like to hope that I'm, you know, that there's some making of space for other people to not be in the shadows anymore. And so if we can do that for one another, if we can kind of really build each other up, I think that there is a stronger, more resilient future for those of us who've been on the margins for a really long time.
Yeah, not to beat a dead horse, but I will say that, you know, to me, a thriving future would just involve a lot of independent food media. Now, I would love, you know, 10 different whetstones and 10 different fiddles that are so influential and have such wide reach that they render, you know, these more stodgy traditional institutions and publications obsolete, because that is where I'm investing my hope, like in independent food media. I mean, you know, for really progressive, you know, writing to exist and live. And, you know, in my job as a professor at NYU, you know, I tell my students all the time that, you know, like I said earlier, you don't need to aspire to write for this big, you know, newspaper anymore to feel like you've made it. You know, I want you to aspire to write for one of these independent publications that will not bulldoze over your voice and, you know, your politics just to fit some sort of a institutional mold. In addition to that, I really do hope, and I write this in the book, that, you know, first of all, I hope that younger, more talented, more hardworking writers than me will write better versions of this book, especially ones that, you know, focus on the stories of women who did not have the class privileges that a lot of the women in this book did. Because, you know, I said this near the start of this conversation, but a lot of these women, you know, they had, you know, they could afford to write memoirs, and, you know, they'd had access to publishing channels. And there's so many stories I wish I could have told with care and tenderness that I was not able to, just because these women, some of these women I wanted to write about, were no longer around to speak for themselves, and they did not leave behind those sorts of texts that presented them speaking in their own voices. And so I do hope that, you know, whomever holds capital, you know, in the food media, food publishing landscape moving forward, is more conscientious of who it gives opportunities to tell their own stories. And I hope that, you know, those figures might come from, you know, outside the middle to upper middle classes, because historically that certainly has not been the case. And I do also hope, finally, last thing, is that journalists like myself are more diligent about gaining the trust of sources from marginalized communities who might have every reason to not trust the media or the food media because of, you know, all the blunders that people within our industry have made historically. So those are three things that I hope happen.
We have a question not too far off that from one of our viewers. She asks, how can we increase the audience of these more progressive food media outlets? How can we get more people on board who do not seek out such perspectives already? I'd be interested in each of you responding, but in your response, could you also just give us a URL or a Twitter handle or whatever where our audience can get in touch with you or follow you in your work?
Well, I don't know how to make people follow these things. I've had like very organic success with my newsletter, and I try and use that platform always to spotlight other people doing similar work or different work, but also good work, obviously. And so I think that it's about sharing on social media. That's where a lot of growth happens for people. Frankly, that's just the truth. And forwarding emails to your friends if you read something that you like, telling writers that you like their work and encouraging them to keep going, especially if it's maybe a smaller newsletter that you've liked or someone's Instagram account that's inspired your cooking. And I am on Twitter at Alicia Kennedy and on Instagram at Alicia D. Kennedy.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, I would just say, open your purse. Like truly support these publications materially, because I have seen, quite a few independent food publications put up GoFundMes, and then weeks later we see from the owner of that publication that they have not reached the funds that they were really expecting, and that is crucial to their survival. So again, not to repeat myself, but the onus shouldn't always fall on the consumer, but also the consumer is complicit in some ways too. And so I do hope that readers will look out for if certain independent food publications are like, okay, I'm setting up this GoFundMe or this fundraising campaign to ensure that this publication lives on beyond next year, that readers actually, support that. Because I've seen so many casual readers just kind of, offer laments after a publication has folded, saying, "Oh man, too bad. I liked what they were doing." It's like, well, did you invest time and what little money you might have in ensuring that it was going to survive? I don't want to ask that question anymore. So, and sorry, you can follow me on Twitter at Senator Mayukh. I am sorry, there's no other handle available. Senator Mayukh, and then my Instagram is mayukh.sen.
Well, I
Yeah,
can't believe it. Go ahead, Reem. Oh yeah, I'm
Oh,
sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I sort of got into, I mean, obviously social media is awesome because people are reposting and all of that, but just like the people that really share your values, ask them what they're reading, you'll find a lot of resources just in those conversations. And you can find me at reem.asil on Instagram and asil_reem on Twitter.
I was overly excited to remind everyone to open their wallets and purses up as we end the program. And so, yes, you can find these folks on Twitter and social media and share the heck out of their work. But also, if you're in the Bay Area, make sure you pop in to Reem's California Mission or Reem's California and go eat with intent and heart and love it and support our community, but also be a part of Alicia Kennedy's newsletter from the desk of Alicia Kennedy. And finally, as I mentioned before, get a copy of Tastemakers, 7 Immigrant Women Who Revolutionized Food in America. It's more than just learning. I think that it's life-changing and it'll give you some thoughts on how you eat, how you support our community. Thank you all for joining us here at the Commonwealth Club. Back to you, John.
Well, thank you again to our special guests on this Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California. And last and not but least, thanks to all of you who are watching or listening to this program. You can find more programs again at commonwealthclub.org/MMS. Have a good weekend. Stay safe. Goodbye.